Hello and welcome to Mindfulness Voyage. My name is Ted Meissner. Thank you so much for being here. If you are returning, welcome back. And if you're new to this, if you wouldn't mind taking a moment to like and subscribe to these videos. It helps people like yourself find these. So, mindfulness is something that is not just a local phenomenon, it's everywhere. And there are organizations who are shifting us from being in a competitive environment to a collaborative one. The Mindfulness Initiative is one of those organizations, and we're going to speak with their executive director about what they're doing, the kinds of services they are offering freely to the world. So let's have that conversation now. Our guest today is Richard Edwards. Richard, welcome to the podcast. Good to see you. Thanks for being here today.
Good to see you, Ted. Thanks for having me.
Very glad to, and have been eager to have this conversation since meeting you at the conference recently. And I'm glad we're finally getting this on the books and able to have the conversation. I'm wondering if you might start by just telling us a little bit about who you are and what it is you do for those who might not know.
Okay, so I'm Richard, and I'm the director of the Mindfulness Initiative, which if you haven't come across it, where have you been? But we are here and we're set at putting mindfulness at the heart of public and social policy. So we do lots of work around Westminster legislature. We have an international forum where we've got representatives from 55 different countries connecting with us. And we've got various different strands of our work that sort of like come together to reach different elements of policy. And one of the exciting elements of that is our innovations work, which reflects back on our experience at conference and seeing how the field is evolving. And we run an Innovation in Mindfulness awards every 2 years. And we back it up with a field book in innovation, looking at how people can take their treasure and share that with the broader world. And so that's a really exciting part of our work, and looking at how people who do, train to be mindfulness teachers can come out of that, and rather than just feeling equipped to teach the curriculum that they've learned to teach, actually bring that to themselves and bring that to the communities that they know, whether that's personal communities or professional communities, and look at how that can adapt, how that can shape to be relevant to different and new communities. And that to me is got to be the future of mindfulness. So that's a really exciting area of our work. And we've got lots of other areas of too. We're doing lots of work around the climate, mindfulness and the inner work in terms of both mitigation and adaptation in terms of climate, how we as individuals come to terms with some of the difficulties that we face in terms of the changing climate, but also bigger than the climate, the polycrisis that we're in, because none of these things stand alone. Yeah. And how do we respond to that rather than react to that? How do we find the resilience to work with that rather than being paralyzed by fear and be forced into a position of anxiety or inaction? How do we take that energy and use it as an energy that is productive, that actually makes a difference on the ground? So some of that work's really exciting that we're doing at the moment.
There's so many layers to all of that, and I want to dive into a few different things that you brought up. Maybe you could say a little bit about, I'm curious, what brought you to mindfulness in the first place? What was your story about? Just a little bit about that.
Well, I suppose I touched on mindfulness many millennia ago when I was a teenager, and I did a very short course on what was called at the time simple meditation. This was, back in the very early 80s. And that stuck with me, and it was something that I found really beneficial. But it didn't really become a regular practice. It was something that I returned to occasionally. And And then later on in life, I developed a degenerative spine disease and experienced quite a lot of pain. And at the time, I was working in a homelessness organisation, a very frontline organisation, working with people who were homeless not because they didn't have a roof over their head, but because they couldn't sustain a roof over their head. People dealing with very complex and compound traumas in their lives. And that job was quite stressful. I found it stressful. And so I began to be aware of the relationship between my physical and mental health. That when I became stressed, for some strange reason, I ended up in more pain. And when I was in more pain, I became more stressed. And going to the doctors or whatever, they wanted to treat one thing or the other. Is it a physical health problem or is it a mental health problem? And I sort of sat there thinking, actually, it's probably neither or both. And so I picked up a book by this bloke, I don't know if you've come across him, a guy called John Kabat-Zinn, and read this, and suddenly it was like, hey, yeah, there is this relationship between your physical and mental health. There is a holistic way of looking at this. And I practiced for quite a while, and for me it became really beneficial and helped me manage my pain and helped me to actually ultimately come off the medication that I was on. I was on a lot of medication. But I reached a sort of point where I felt as if I couldn't go any further. And I went on my first 8-week mindfulness course. And it was that glass ceiling moment where the ceiling opens up, and I had this sudden flash of insight that I was doing something wrong. I'd mistaken resignation for compassionate acceptance. And I'd come to terms with my back. Had resigned myself to the pain that I was in, but I hadn't compassionately accepted it. And I'd intellectualized it. I understood the theory behind it, but it was that sudden feeling of what the difference between those two things meant, the difference between resignation and compassionate acceptance. And from then on, it became a bug, and it was like, yeah, this is really fundamentally important. And working in the field that I was working in, I recognized that it wasn't just something that was important for me personally. I was working with people who, for all intents and purposes, felt broken. And how do you begin to help people come to terms with traumatic experiences that are paralyzing their ability to move forward with their lives? How do you do that? And we talk about therapeutic interventions and all of those things, but actually it was something much deeper and more fundamental than that. So yes, that's where I became interested in it. And yeah.
Yeah, and what you shared here first, thank you for your openness about all of this, the work that you've done, your own experience with it. And we've had many conversations here on this podcast and others about that kind of thing, that it's not just about stress management. It is helping people with deep-seated problems, traumatic experiences, and that we're not stuck. We're in this, and that can be a very important distinguishing characteristic between resignation and compassionate acceptance to whatever it is we happen to be encountering, because that enables us to move forward with it. And this is one of the reasons why I wanted to talk with you today about the work that the initiative is doing, because it is one of the leaders that I see in the field of mindfulness, and it is a very wide field. With kinds of things like innovation. We've had Vin on the podcast to talk about the Innovation Awards. And I particularly like one of the things that the initiative has done is create publications out of the work that you're doing. And one of those is about innovating and building innovations in mindfulness programs. I wonder if you might say just a little bit about some of those tangibles that have been produced through the work of the initiative and others that you've been partnering with over the years.
Absolutely. And I think, that's been one of the the strong elements of the Mindfulness Initiative, that it has produced these publications, and we talk about innovations, and we produced a field book, which is a very practical guide to looking at how do you innovate. We talk about being innovative and doing something different, but what does that actually look like in practice? What's the warp and the weft of that in terms of developing mindfulness practices and bringing it to life in a new field, in a new area, in a new community, in a new profession? What does a mindful bricklayer look like? Is it always about sitting on a cushion, or are there other aspects to this? And what does that mean, and how do you bring that to life, and how do you make it relevant to people's lives, rather than dragging people's lives to your way of looking at inner work, your way of looking at compassion, your way of looking at all of the aspects of mindfulness that we hold to be important. Do we have the only way of reaching that? Do we have the only way of delivering that?
Yeah, this is such an important aspect, that it's not the only way. And this is one of the wonderful insights that the initiative brings, is it is different for different people. And there are selective pressures, shall we say, in the evolution of mindfulness. And I'm wondering if you might share, what are some of the things that you perceive as some of the challenges that we face within the field today? And what are some things the initiative might be doing around those?
I think some of the barriers that we face is that mindfulness, in the way that I learnt it, in the way that I've taught it, has been quite a white middle class activity. And having come from working for a lot of years with people who are othered by society because of a whole host of issues, which has led to homelessness in their cases. This is not your traditional group of people. So does that mean that mindfulness isn't relevant to groups like this? Does it mean that it doesn't have a place for them in terms of meeting people who feel othered, who feel in some cases broken, who feel disassociated from society, who perhaps are withdrawing from society for a whole plethora of reasons, people that are grinding to a halt within the polycrisis, people not having children anymore because they're frightened of the world that their child is going to inherit. Does mindfulness have a place reaching beyond the audience that it has at the moment? And I believe that it does. That's not to say that the audience that mindfulness works with at the moment isn't benefiting from it, but there's such a huge need out there that perhaps it needs to adapt. It needs to adapt without losing any of the depth, any of the integrity, and starting to build a new evidence base around that, because that's one of the things that the Mindfulness Initiative has always been very keen on, is pointing to the evidence base. Of saying, when the criticism comes, mindfulness is just a bit of woo-woo, tree-huggy nonsense sitting on a mat. It's not really engaging with the real world. We've always been an organisation that points to the evidence and says, no, look, the evidence is here, the evidence is clear. But sometimes the danger of that is that it can become self-fulfilling. You do the same thing over and over again because it worked once. Yeah, and so trying new ideas and new audiences and new ways of presenting what we know and we feel is important, and then saying, well, how do we gather evidence around that? How do we start building new evidence bases around that? That to me is really, really important. And that's partly why a lot of the work we're doing now is around that nexus between the inner work and the polycrisis, framed a lot around the environment and the climate crisis. And that's really fundamental to a lot of work at the moment, because it's something that people can really understand. It affects so many people.
Yeah, and what I particularly admire about what you're just describing is it's taking mindfulness, this gem of, yes, it can help you deal with stress, with the difficulties in your life. And the way we're doing it and the way the research supports is more about turning towards than turning away from. We're not doing avoidance and suppression, rather, mindfulness is a way to help us clearly see, face, acknowledge what is here, not just, noticed it and then I'm distracted again, but really acknowledge to choose how we respond to that. Again, as you said, being more responsive to it than reactive. It's not about turning away from the practicalities of day in, day out life, but how mindfulness can help inform us about how we change those conditions.
Absolutely. And so when we look at the polycrisis that we're facing at the moment, I'm often reminded of the quote of Richard Louv, who said that we cannot protect what we do not love, and we cannot love what we do not know, and we cannot know what we don't touch and see and smell and sense. So to me, that is a real manifestation of the importance of that inner work to facilitate that connection with ourselves, that connection with each other, and the connection with the grass that we're walking on. You know, to me, there's that natural connection. And in a world at the moment where so many people, particularly young people, are experiencing nature deficit disorder, you know, where they're viewing their entire world through these screens that we've got in front of ourselves. And if they're not experiencing it, if they're not seeing themselves as intrinsically part of nature, but are viewing themselves as other to nature, then we're never going to solve the problems that we're facing at the moment, because it's always going to be a technical solution that we're looking for rather than a solution that is about us. Yeah,
The depth of the solutions that focus on connecting rather than what society has right now, which is a great deal of division. How do we turn that around? I'm curious, Richard, for you, with your background, your interests, the things that have affected you in your life, what are some of the things you're most excited about that the initiative will get involved with in the coming years? Or what would you like to see that might not be in the plans yet?
well, I think, you know, one of the things that, you know, I've been in post now for just over a year, so I'm still the new kid on the block, if you like. New being, you know, wearing thin, kid definitely worn thin many years ago. But, you know, one of the things I was very keen to do is to develop a strategy for the organisation to look at what needed to happen as we move forward. So one of the things that I'm keen to look at is about developing a forum model, effectively, of looking at some of the areas of public and social policy, which sort of like winds back to the beginning of the organisation. The first publication that we produced as an organisation was the Mindful Nation report, which was a massive, amazing report, a real forerunner of so much work. But it looked at the role of mindfulness in 4 areas of social policy. It looked at it in terms of education, health, the workplace, and the 4th one. I always do that. I always list 4 things and then can never remember them like that. So workplace, education, health, and the criminal justice system. And so it looked at those 4 areas of social policy and made recommendations around that. And then, you know, push that out into the world. And what we need to do now, I think, is to return partly to that. And, you know, there's huge strengths in the reports that the organisation has written, but there's a lot of strength that needs to be built into the follow through on that. Of, you know, we bring people together to write reports. We don't just sit in a dark room and write them ourselves and send them out. You know, there's lots of networking, there's lots of involvement in terms of putting those reports together. But once they're produced, you know, to a certain extent, that piece of work's been done. But for me, that piece of work then starts. So what I actually want to do is, as we do these things, is to put together a network of individuals who are interested in these areas of social policy, be it mindfulness in education as an example, and keep those people in a room and say, okay, what are we saying? What's working? What isn't working? Why is this working? Why isn't that working? What are the barriers that we're facing? What recommendations do we want to put across today? How are we going to follow those recommendations through? Whose doors are we going to knock on to say, look, we've got this recommendation, can it become a reality? And when they say, oh, that's really good, we follow that up and say, what difference did it make? You know, when we talk about putting mindfulness into NICE guidelines within the NHS, great. What's changed as a result of that? You know, has it been taken up? Has it been developed? And if it hasn't, where's the push going there? So for me, it is, you know, somebody said to me when I first started that the Mindfulness Initiative was seen as a think tank. And in some respect, we need to be a little bit less think and a little bit more tank. And so this is about really pushing that agenda forward, and rather than just being the thought leader on it, we're an organisation that's prepared to roll our sleeves up and say, you know, how are we going to make this happen? How are we going to push this forward? So that for me is really, really exciting, particularly in areas like education, when we're looking at really important social issues at the moment around things like refugees and people who are displaced across the globe. You know, what are we doing in terms of reaching that, you know, making a difference there? We're seeing huge barriers being put up to meeting climate objectives at the moment. You know, how can we use inner work to actually bridge that gap between what we know and what we do? You know, and that for me is the important thing. You know, how do we turn what we know into what we actually do? And so for me, that's the future of the organisation.
That makes a huge difference, is the why are we creating this information, having these metrics, having these reports, if we don't actually do anything with it? And I often see that in many organizations having nothing to do with mindfulness, that will do some check-ins and get some feedback, and like, oh, and here's our report, and there's no follow-up. There's nothing that's actually being done to address what that revealed. So thank you for that work. And as we wrap up our conversation for today, I'm just wondering if you have any parting words or encouragements for those who may be struggling a bit with the polycrisis, or maybe interested in finding out more about the initiative and what you're doing.
Absolutely. Well, you're not alone, I think, is the first point there. I think, you know, the polycrisis is affecting all of us. Some of us it's affecting a lot more immediately than others. But I think it is about that connection. And I think, you know, please reach out to the Mindfulness Initiative. You know, hopefully you'll put a link to our website and all of that stuff, so that we can, you know, bring people into our community. We have an international network of people who are working to bring mindfulness to the forefront of policy and legislature. We're putting together a network of individuals to support people trying to bring inner work to climate change and climate adaptation and climate mitigation. You know, there is connection there. So find that connection.
Great. Thank you. And as you said, there will be links where links are found. This appears in a lot of different platforms, so you know where to look for those, but that will include links to the Mindfulness Initiative. Our guest today, Richard Edwards. Richard, thank you so much for being here. I hope you'll come back again soon.
Thank you, Ted. Thank you.
Thank you so much for watching this episode about the work of the Mindfulness Initiative. And do remember to like and subscribe to this podcast if you got some value out of it and want to share it with others. And remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can, and I'll see you again soon.